Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this week's events for Black History Month. My name is Alexander Burns, and I'm going to be one of the moderators this morning. We're looking forward to hearing from Lisa Leung-Tat on Yin Yoga. Before we begin, there are some disclaimers. The views expressed by the speakers and workshop facilitators do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the organizing groups. All programming uses the Zoom meeting or webinar format. The webinar format is to prevent unexpected interruptions. Questions for speakers can be submitted using the Q&A chat function at the end of the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, and good morning to everyone. My name is Lisa Leung-Tat, as Alex mentioned, and I am just gonna do a presentation this morning on how my Yin Yoga practice has helped me to stay grounded. And after the presentation, I welcome questions, feedback. And so let me just share my screen here. I hope you can all see that. So again, good morning. I am a senior administrative manager in the Cancer Center here at Mass General Hospital. I am also a certified yoga instructor. And as I'm sure many of you can imagine and relate to, our lifestyle is just fueled by a constant need to rush and get to the next thing, right? Virtual access and technology have rendered our lives an open door. And over the past 2 years of the pandemic, this balance between our life and our work has been fused so that the line that's typically drawn between them, has sort of disappeared, right? And so during this presentation, I'd like to share with you some of the ways in which I navigate the hustle and bustle of my role as a manager, a mom, a wife, a student, and an active participant in society. I have to say that still there are many instances where, I can become anxious, maybe overwhelmed by deadlines and self-imposed limits I place on myself. But always when I come back to my handy toolbox of things I can use to bring me back to my center, there's my practice of Yin. And so I'd just like to share with you a little bit about how that shows up. So the Taoists believe that harmony and health are influenced when the contrasting patterns of our life are in balance. So not one more than the other. So as such, in the same way, we need faster, more dynamic movement to strengthen our body, targeting our larger muscle group through maybe, let's say, cycling, or you're running, you're swimming. We also need a slower approach to strengthen our deeper connective tissue and also our mind. And so the purpose of physical practices, or the physical practice of yoga, is really to prepare the body and mind for a deeper practice of meditation. So engaging more intentionally with being present and turning down the volume of the constant mental chatter that besieges us throughout our conscious moments. If we're only looking at yoga practice, for instance, let's say your vinyasa or ashtanga and that quicker movement and style, that is considered yang-like, right? It's quicker, you move on the breath, sometimes you even build a sweat. While anything that's slower and a more meditative practice is considered yin-like. And so hence the term Yin Yoga. So Yin Yoga, as I said, is based on an ancient Taoist philosophies and traditional Chinese medicine principles. It seeks to go deeper, targeting the fascial matrix, ligaments, joints, bones. It aims to free up congestion and release stagnant energy, almost akin to like the use of acupuncture to move qi throughout the body, right? And so in order to influence this deeper connective tissue, this practice of yin yoga requires that we sit in poses for a longer period of time. And so as you listen to me describing this process, this idea of sitting in a shape for a long period of time, you find that you're already getting anxious at the notion of sitting still. That is because typically we're not encouraged to do so. Slowing down is frowned upon because it means we're not doing. And if we're not doing, then we're not performing. We're not striving towards a goal. We're not part of the race. That race, though, in many instances, can sometimes be anxiety-provoking. That need to always be on the go and looking to do the next best thing, it causes us to miss out on what is actually happening in the moment, right here, right now. We also know when we get revved up in the body internally, the body begins releasing stress hormones, which again causes adverse effects in the body. So think of all the times you multitask throughout the day. How many times do you find you're fully engaged in a conversation without thinking of a few other things you have on your list to do? How much might you have missed in not being totally connected as someone shared something with you, or as you listened to one meeting while trying to schedule another? And so that treadmill that we are constantly on is why sometimes it's really challenging to step off. So from a physical standpoint, the fascial matrix of our body is almost like shrink wrap, encapsulating the muscles and the bones. And when this is underused, for instance, through long days at the desks or inactive lifestyles, that shrink wrap becomes less elastic or malleable, and it can lead to achiness and stiffness, especially in the joints as we grow older. When we sit in poses for a sustained length of time, that helps in positively affecting the tissue. So strengthening it, hydrating it, and increasing mobility in whatever areas we're trying to target. What we find, though, is as we try to remain still, that the sensations that may be experienced can sometimes cause us to want to fidget or move around. And the mind begins to convince you that readjusting is going to make it better. And so this is the part where your mind intersects with what is happening in your body, and where we can notice what is happening, just as a way of being able to see this interplay that occurs. Being acutely aware of what is happening in the body is paramount in fully appreciating how this practice works. Noticing how quickly your mind wants to disconnect, how you want to get out of the pose, and the many other distractions that may come up or manifest because you feel compelled to move. And so I'm not saying that if you're in a pose and you're in pain, you should stay there. That's really important, right? But notice, am I in pain, or is this an uncomfortable way because this is not my usual way of sitting or folding over or existing in a space, right? This mental alertness in noticing how your body and mind is responding to stillness is how we begin to cultivate a deeper appreciation for what is happening in the body. So here are a few poses that is practiced in Yin. And so most of the poses in Yin is floor-based, right? So as I mentioned before, we're sitting in these poses for a long period of time. And so there are 4 tenets to the practice. So the first tenet is called coming to your edge. And that means getting to a point where you feel a sensation that is outside of your neutral realm. So, whatever pose that is instructed, you're thinking about a spectrum of 1 to 10, and you're allowing a sensation to arise, let's say between 3 and 6. And that in itself needs to be attended to, because we've become so accustomed to striving and reaching to the end that, you can be in a pose, and if you're not feeling a whole lot of sensation, you tend to feel as though, oh, I'm not doing the pose right. And so as the offset, this practice is very functional. It's not concerned with the aesthetics or how the pose looks. Really, it's more about how does this pose feel in your body. So the second tenet of the practice is that as you come to this place, so this 3 to 6 sensation, you then begin to soften in the pose. And what that means is typically when you fold over or when you bend or when you flex, the body immediately grips. And that is a way of protecting, right? That is a way for anticipating something is about to happen. But you're in a practice, you're in a yin practice, you're probably safely at home or maybe in a studio. And so you know that this is something that you're doing. And so you're trying to fool the body into this protection and gripping. And so as you fold over into the pose, the idea is that you soften and release this gripping that you might be feeling. And it takes some practice because we're so accustomed once again to gripping and resisting that it has almost become something that is natural, right? So softening in the pose, releasing the muscle, letting go of any gripping, that is the second tenet of the practice. And then the third tenet of this yin practice is sitting relatively still once you've gotten to a point that you can sustain. So that 3 to 6 area, once you recognize that, yep, I feel a sensation, yes, I can hold this for a minute, 2 minutes or longer, then you become still in that pose. And the idea is that it takes 90 seconds of sitting in a space for a period of time for the body to begin to realize what happened and the inner mechanics to begin to do the work, right? So stretching the tendons and the connective tissue, releasing more fluid so that the area becomes more hydrated. And that's the purpose of staying in the poses for a long period of time. The fourth and really important tenet is when you're coming out of this pose, you want to do so slowly, right? So if you look at these poses that are on the screen, for instance, in the top left corner, this lady is in what is called caterpillar. It's a forward fold. She is seated. You might find that if you practice this pose, you might not get all the way down. I think one of the most important things that I'd like to reiterate is that it's less about what the pose looks like and how it feels in your body. So you are not competing with anyone, right? You're following the direction. So if I were to instruct this pose, remember we're on the floor. So I may say something like, bring your legs together, let your feet flex, lengthen in your spine, and begin to release into a forward fold, extending your arms out to the side and going down only as much as your body will allow in this moment. And that is important for the practice because, again, we're not looking to push and strive. Right, so these are a few yin poses. There's the forward fold, there's child's pose in the middle, butterfly pose where you see the knee is open out and the hips are externally rotated. The person is folded forward, arms are extended in front of them. In the middle here with this blue background is what is called pigeon pose. That is a pose that we consider to be a spicy pose, because as soon as you get into the pose, you can feel the sensation. So these are just a few yin poses. In this practice, though, there are two things happening concurrently. One is, as you sit in the poses for 2 minutes or more, your body ever so slowly begins to give in, so to speak, to yield into the shape. But this takes time, takes patience. Secondly, as you sit in the shape, you notice how the mind begins to wander. It begins to try to get you to be distracted. It begins to want to disconnect, almost in an effort to pull you away from what is happening right here, right now, to distract you from the sensation that might be arising in the pose. And that is critical because it allows us to notice how the mind affords us distance when things get uncomfortable. And just noticing that, again, we're not trying to judge what is happening. We're noticing how the body responds when it is not in a neutral space, when it is not in a neutral stance, when things are a little different than normal, right? So this is where the true value of the practice begins. The idea of sitting with what is uncomfortable and almost befriending that sensation so as to remain present and in the moment, to fully embody the experience. That is where the true mental growth is seated. That's where you begin to explore the mental capacity. So just as you are influencing the joint areas with the aim of not just lengthening and hydrating, but also strengthening, it's the same premise for the mind. So coming back to the practice over and over again sort of allows your mind to build capacity for what is happening in the body, right? For letting go, for resting in silence, and for staying present and in the moment. Bringing a meditative approach to the practice is key in learning how to manage your breath through sensations, how to self-regulate, and how to tap into your parasympathetic nervous system as you allow the breath to balance the body and the mind. So these are some of the benefits that can occur through a constant yin practice, right? So physically improving flexibility, promoting good connective tissue health, improving in your posture. You begin to become very aware of ways in which we naturally sit just out of habit. It lubricates the joints and sort of improves our range of motion. The mental growth is really what has connected me to the practice. So this idea of, while I'm in a situation, thinking about it as my yin practice and my yin pose, right? Allowing myself to stay calm for a long period of time and really tapping into that space and that constant practice as a resource. So who should practice yin? Well, yin yoga, I think, is good for everyone, right? As long as each person takes full ownership of their practice and their body and treat it with care and compassion. We have this one architecture of, a body that we exist in. And I think it's critical that whatever we're doing, we do so with care and compassion. If you're someone who might be overstimulated and constantly wired, yin might be a practice for you. And if you're looking for a different option or an added option to your toolbox of things to mediate stress, this may be a practice for you, right? If you're looking to, dip your toes in the water as far as meditation is concerned, this might be a good start, right? I think one of the really challenging things at least for me, is this idea of stepping off the treadmill, right? That gets promoted so often that we become entrenched in it. And when we're asked to sit in silence, it almost seems as though it's something that we can't do because we're so accustomed to being on the go. And one can argue that sometimes being on the go constantly really is producing stress within our body that we're not even aware of. And if we're to continue to exist in a space that promotes health, then why not develop practices and coping mechanisms to mitigate that? So what else do you do when you're sitting in these poses for 2 to 5 minutes? That's about it, really. Most of what I've related so far really speaks to the physical aspect of the practice, right? The doing, so to speak. But as I mentioned before, once you get familiar with this idea of sitting still, you know, as you have the experience of the pose, then the next step is, where do you focus your attention? How can you use your breath? And why, to me at least, I think this practice was so life-changing. What I discovered was that each time I practiced, I was learning to sit with these uncomfortable sensations, right? And while that might have strengthened my physical being, what was also happening was that I was building a mental capacity. Understanding how your breath is a key component of the practice and life overall is really important. You know, knowing to breathe deeply, knowing to let that breath go all the way into your abdominal cavity, and then releasing purposely so that you can let go of anything that you might be holding on to. This helps to calm your body, it helps to slow down the mind, and it activates our ever so valuable parasympathetic nervous system. So you're probably like, why do we need to activate that? Well, we know that our autonomic system is divided into both, right? So your sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight, flight, and freeze, which I feel as though we're in that all the time. And then our parasympathetic nervous system, which is like your rest and digest system. This system that slows us down, sort of allows for the busyness to simmer. It produces calming effects and allows us to feel relaxed. It can also reduce stress within the system and allow the body to recuperate, so to speak, from adverse impacts, right? One of the things I remember clearly is that as I was younger, when you were growing up, you know, if you get flustered, one of the things you would hear folks say is to count to 10. And there was a reason for that. It was that once you brought your attention to the counting, that allowed you to focus on something else, taking the mind out of this riled up position that you were in and allowing you to come to a space where you can better manage what was happening before you. Stepping into the parasympathetic nervous system is deeply nourishing, right? And it almost allows for the riding of the wave that is constantly happening before us. So the breath, allowing it to really center you and coming back to it often, helping to cultivate this continued mental space that creates some clarity so that you can better manage the experience. It allows you to be a little calmer, right? Less chaotic. And then, of course, activating the system so that it can help to reduce stress. So as you practice Yin, hopefully you're interested in, developing a practice. As you sit in poses, you're learning, so to speak, how to moderate stress. So when I showed this pose earlier, Pigeon Pose, I talked about it being, what I like to say is spicy, right? So what is happening in your body as you feel the sensation of sitting in this pose? Ultimately, with practice, continued practice, you increase your capacity for that sensation, and the body also becomes a little more yielding to this pose when you get into it each time. But this idea of moderating the pose is something you can take off the mat as well. And so when I say this, I mean this same aptitude we have for developing capacity is what we can take off the mat when we're navigating life, right? So oftentimes finding yourself in a situation that can feel like pigeon pose. Yeah. Sitting down in a meeting and, going back and forth and trying to manage what is happening, both externally, but also how you feel within, right? So oftentimes situations can feel like pigeon pose or any other pose that might bring up a lot of sensations in your body. But taking the same premise of allowing the breath to help guide you through the uncomfortable feeling is the same tool that you can take when you're sort of bumped up into situations at work, school, or home. And so with everything, what is required is a practice, right? And so as I wrap up this presentation of a Yin practice that's both physical, but can also be mental, and give you tools to not just use on the mat, but off the mat as well. Think about ways in which you can use that. Think about ways in which you can build your capacity, about ways in which you can use a practice, not just physically, but mentally. And so again, what has helped me to be grounded is this idea of always tapping into what I already have available to me. Using my breath to settle my soul, so to speak. To bring me back to what is happening. To not disconnect because it doesn't feel comfortable in the moment. To really help to be more mindful about what is being expressed in front of me so that, I can use my executive functioning because there's not a whole flurry of things happening at the forefront, that I can clear and make space so that I can think, with intention and think more clearly. So Yin Yoga is for everybody. I invite you, right now as I end the slideshow and the physical practice to ask questions. I will try my best to answer them in as much as the experience has shown up for me. And so I hope that you enjoyed the presentation, hopefully, you took some pointers away. And so thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. We really appreciate it. That was a great presentation. And I knew the differences between yin and yang, but I didn't understand the differences when it came to yoga. So that's definitely interesting to see, as well as, understanding the applicability of doing such poses in a meeting and allowing it to break up your workday. It's definitely a great way to cope with, burnout and whatnot. So thank you for that. It looks like we do have a question in the chat, and I would definitely encourage our attendees to ask, as much as you would like to, because we have such a great and valuable resource here with us, Lisa.
Yeah.
But I'll give you this question. I'll read it for you, and I'll leave it to you to answer live.
Yep.
So great talk. How do you combine this with other forms of yoga?
Yeah. So Yin Yoga is complementary, right? So it's not meant to replace your other styles of yoga. So when I first started the discussion, I talked about, the yang and the yin and this idea of being in balance. And in order to be in balance, we have to be doing both, right? So yin shouldn't be your only yoga practice. If you're a yoga student, practitioner, it should be used as a complementary form of yoga. So you still would need your regular practices if it's not yang style of yoga, your riding, your jogging, all the things that you do, to really target your larger muscle group, right? So when you do things like faster flows, you're really targeting the superficial muscles, and that is needed. You're using yin both as a way to target your connective tissues, so the dense connective tissue that exists like in your joints, and your shoulders and your hips. You're using the practice to really open up that space and be able to improve mobility by influencing those areas, right? So that's a physical aspect. And then mentally, it's this way of opening the door into a meditative space. I know sometimes folks can have an adverse reaction to meditating because we've become so conditioned to being on this rat race and this treadmill. It's really hard to sit still. But once you begin doing this practice, if you're sitting in poses for 2 to 5 minutes, right? The idea is like, what's happening during that time? I'm not talking, right? So you're forced to really have this experience in your body and fully appreciate the sensations that's arising. So you're connecting with yourself and being in the present moment.
Thank you. Appreciate that. That was a great question, and we have another great question actually in the chat as well. And I'm actually curious about this one as well. Are there any, are there dietary suggestions that go along with Yin Yoga?
That's a really good question. Not as far as I know. And I think we might want to think about, how do you treat your body independent of yoga, right? Independent of anything else. This is the one container that we have. And I think managing what we put into this container is important in understanding, what do we want out of it? I would say for sure, as is everything else, drinking water is paramount to just existing, to just living. I tend to feel thirsty, and I've heard that from students as well, when you get out of a practice. But I think hydrating is the one thing I would attest to, that if you are thinking of dietary, what kinds of ways in which you can influence the practice, water is key. I do know, and I don't have, a whole wealth of information on this as well. The traditional Chinese way of approaching things really depends on who you are as a person, right? So you can either be very earthy or very fiery. I was recently with an acupuncturist who, and I know this to be true, talked about me being a very earthy and grounded person. And so that means I tend to settle easily. And so I might need a little more fire. And it's true. If I can do yin yoga all day, every day, that will be it. But I know that I need a little bit of that burning to happen in my body. And so I need to add that intentionally, a vinyasa flow or a running or a quick walk to my my repertoire of things that I do to promote optimal health.
Thank you for that, Lisa. We appreciate it. All righty. Well, it looks like there are no more questions in the chat. I would ask if you guys have any, please, feel free to put them in there because,
or even give feedback, right? Just
yeah,
share things that, you might think not necessarily of yourself, but maybe of the presentation. What did you think of it? Was this meaningful or valuable to you at this point in time in your day? Do you feel like you're a little encouraged to try Yin?
I will say personally, I'll answer part of that question for you. I'm interested in trying Yin mostly because I'm the type of person that likes to, I guess, understand the rationale behind things. And prior to this, I had done yoga in a very small setting and not very often, and certainly not in recent history. But hearing you give explanation and, it's known that with practice you become more flexible, but I'm not the most flexible person on earth. So it's nice to hear, just some rationale behind actually performing the yoga rather than rationale behind doing it. I mean, obviously you gave rationale behind doing it, but the rationale behind it as a whole is important to me as someone who kind of gets usually held up on these types of things.
Yeah, and we get really hung up on this idea of doing, right? And feeling that if we're not, doing it like that other person, then we're doing it wrong. One of the things I really appreciate about at least my influences in being accredited in Yin Yoga is reinforcing over and over that this is a functional practice. This practice doesn't focus on the aesthetics of a pose. And this is not meaning that we're cavalier about how we get into a pose. We're not going to be careless about it. But when I get into a pose, when I get into pigeon, my pigeon pose is not going to look like your pigeon pose. And it doesn't mean that I'm doing the pose wrong or you're doing the pose wrong. It just means that's how the pose shows up in the body you have. And that is critical in us being able to appreciate who we are as human beings and really being okay with the bodies that we exist in. Because culturally, that has not been the regular practice, right? We've had this practice where we're oftentimes conditioned by, media and language about what we should be like. And we spend a lot of our lives just existing in spaces where we're not happy with ourselves. And that is such a waste and such a way to really impinge on who we are as human beings. And so I often say in my practice, don't look at the screen, don't look at the person next to you if you're in studio. Really be intentional about your practice and remaining present. So allowing yourself to have that full experience of what it feels like to be in these poses. What is your body telling you? Listening to what your body is telling you. So, if you land into a pose, not pushing aggressively through that communication where your body is like, Lisa, this is where I want to go this morning. Being okay with that. And understanding that, there's a time and place for everything. And when you're in a space for Yin practice, is really to promote your health at a deeper capacity, but also this idea of mentally observing what is happening, right? So that when you're off the mat, you can appreciate, so when I'm in a conversation that's really spicy, that is getting my body revved up, how can I allow myself to settle? How can I, call on my breath? How can I feel as though, oh, this is a pigeon pose that's happening, or a dragon pose, or whatever. I tend to land in pigeon because that is usually what people speak a whole lot about when they're getting into the pose.
Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate that. Yeah, I definitely would, echo the latter sentiments of making sure not to compare yourself to others, especially when you're on the mat. And that could be, brought into real life application, like you said, with
Absolutely.
using some of those yoga practices to kind of cut yourself off at the knees when you're presented with something that's a little difficult.
Absolutely.
So thank you.
Yeah.
We do have some praise in the Q&A for you. Just that it was a meaningful presentation, great way to start the day. Thank you. I'm encouraged to try. I love how you related the pigeon pose to feelings we may experience during meetings at work. I definitely
Yeah.
would agree with that.
Yeah.
And then
Good.
in addition to the praising, we also have a question here. Thank you for an amazing presentation. I learned so much. Lisa, where can we take a class with you?
So Lisa Leung-Tat Yoga will take you to Four Corners, and that's just the easiest way probably for you to remember how to get to me. I teach under the umbrella of Four Corners Yoga and Wellness. It is in the community. It is in Dorchester. Currently, Yin is being offered only virtually, and it's Saturday mornings at 9:30. So right now I teach just one yoga class, one Yin class, sorry, at Four Corners, and then I also, do a slow flow on Monday evenings. But once you go to the website, you can follow the links that take you to Four Corners, and maybe I can see you on a Saturday morning.
That would definitely be awesome to see some of the attendees here, as well as some of the
Yeah,
panelists. I mean, I know I would love to join. So thank you for that. We also have another question in here, a two-part question, I should say. Does your practice influence your day-to-day? And do you have any tips?
Yes, yes. I try to, the first thing I am an early riser, so I get up at 4:30 in the morning. I can't help it. I love the quiet of the morning that helps me to get my day started. So one of the things I do when I get up at 4:30 is that I have a short meditation practice where I can, find silence. I have begun to really crave the stillness and the silence. And it sets the tone for my day. It allows me to sort of see the day in a totally different way. If I don't practice and if I don't meditate, let's say for about 3 days, I feel the effect of that. I feel myself, especially at work, being shorter, having, a tendency to not have an attention span for stuff, getting riled up really easily. And I know that it's my practice, right? It really helps to ground me. And it does fluctuate from day to day. The more I practice, and this is not saying this is what folks should do. For me, the more I practice, the more I am able to show up in a way that I really want to show up. And what I mean by that is sometimes when we're in situations, sometimes when the day gets crazy, you can have reactions to people and to situations that once you get home in the afternoon and you've had a moment to breathe, you realize, oh, that's not really how I wanted to respond to someone, right? That's not really the answer I wanted to give. And the reason why you have that difference is that once you get home and you let the weight off and you lighten the load and you reflect, you're then able to see the situation differently, right? From a slower aspect. And this is what you carry with you if you're practicing often. You're actually taking this reflection and reflective view more often. And again, I said in the beginning that there are days when, I am off, and I know I am off, and I really try to remain intentional about that. But I always come back to, okay, Lisa, you're having this reaction because you're not slowing down, because you're not using your breath, because this is too much in this moment. So I'm able to have this internal dialogue to help me manage what is happening, both internally and externally, because we know that when we get riled up, besides our facial reactions and what is happening internally in our body, there's a whole slew of things that's happening as well, right? Your breath changes, your heart begins to race, you feel things occurring in your body. And so if you can be aware of that in the moment, it can sometimes help to show up differently.
Thank you. I know that personally, I definitely am intrigued by your presentation. I will say that, Lisa, just because I've been kind of, thinking of ways to deal with when I'm throwing those curveballs. And one thing that I currently do is, breathing, trying to delineate between chest breathing and stomach breathing. Usually when you're in those
Right.
tough situations, you're chest breathing. And if you can get yourself to stomach breathe, you can kind of, not to say this for a third time, but cut yourself off at the knees, right?
Yeah.
So definitely I could see yoga, or at least yin yoga specifically, as one of those, mechanisms, which is definitely useful. The person who asked the previous question, a dear friend and part of our family here at the People's Heart, Dia, had a follow-up for you and said, I love the number of times you said practice, Lisa. How do you maintain that?
Just reminding yourself of how important you are, right? If we're not treating ourselves with the same grace and compassion that we extend to people, how are we operating from a space where our cup is continually filled? And again, reiterating that this is not perfection, that you will find there sometimes, depending on what's happening in your life, days at a time where you haven't had the chance to carve out 30 minutes to have a practice, right? But realizing that, not judging yourself for it, coming back to this, space of, okay, I can start today, or I can start tomorrow. Being compassionate and giving yourself grace when you fall off the proverbial ladder, so to speak, is important because, again, we've been conditioned to think and do life a certain way. And, this idea of slowing down, of forgiving yourself, is not something that is practiced, right? And really trying to bring this into your life, I feel, is critical in managing the craziness that we are often, I love how you say, dodging, we're always dodging balls, and they're always there, right? Even if we're trying to dodge, they're always coming at us, sometimes from spaces that we can't even see. So it's just really important to bring a practice to yourself consistently. The same way you get up, you brush your teeth, you take a shower, it's the same way you should include a practice, whether it's a meditation practice, a yin practice, a yoga practice, whatever practice that you're engaging. Start small, and then really add on to that, and not be judgmental of yourself if you go a couple days and you forget or you don't do it. Just start again. There's always an opportunity each day to start again.
I absolutely love that. I would agree with you. There's always an opportunity to start again. And I'm of the mindset, if we don't look backwards, then you can't regress backwards, and we can change the future. We cannot change the past. So
Right,
definitely with you on that.
Absolutely.
There's definitely some more love for you in the Q&A. Thank you for that very helpful reminder to give ourselves the love. And I definitely would echo that. It's important to love yourself while trying to love others.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
on that, is there any other questions, or should I say, are there any other questions that we can answer, or that we could field for Lisa this morning, or is that where we're going to leave it at?
Yeah, and if not, just, thank you for the folks who showed up. This is different because it's a webinar. I can't see the folks who have shown up, but thank you so much for showing up for the presentation, for the talk. As you go out into your day, as you exit into spaces, just reminding yourself that we're not in a war zone. It seems like that sometimes. And to just allow yourself, if nothing else, to remind yourself to take moments of deep breathing. The chest breathing is something that we do naturally, but this idea of really shutting down for a minute, 2 minutes, and just allowing yourself to recalibrate is super important in promoting well-being as we continue to exist in the spaces that we're in. So thank you so much for everyone who showed up. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Lisa, for having us and for definitely, giving us the plethora of knowledge that you have and helping us, move forward. Hopefully, we'll see some of you in one of those Saturday morning yoga classes. I know I definitely will be joining at some point. So Lisa Leung-Tat, everyone, thank you for your time and thanks for having us.
Thank you so much. Bye.